Okay, so let us begin in the traditional way with the verse of homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, welcome everybody. And this is now Friday evening, September 1st, so the first session. I always have to say that for the benefit of the recorder. Okay, so during 4 years, starting in 2013, each Labor Day weekend, we held here an what's called an Abhidhamma retreat based on a work called the Abhidhammata Sangha, which is translated the Manual of Abhidhamma, and then together with all of the commentary that I added to it, it became the comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma. And so we completed that book last Labor Day weekend, but people are still saying, we want more Abhidhamma, we want more Abhidhamma. So I'm confronted with the problem, what do I do? We've completed the basics of the system. So I thought to take some chapters from the Visuddhimagga, which is the major treatise of Buddhist doctrine and meditation in the Theravada tradition, and then use this as a basis for this Abhidhamma course. Okay, now the primary focus of the Visuddhimagga is practical. It's divided into 3 major sections, which are concerned with sila, or moral discipline, ethical behavior. Then it has a very large section on samadhi, where it explains all of the different meditation subjects that are conducive to samadhi or concentration. And then the 3rd major section is on panya, or wisdom. Now, at the beginning of the section on wisdom, the Visuddhimagga has a section called the soil of understanding, or the soil of wisdom. And the purpose of that section, of those chapters, is to lay out the basic material that is to be understood, digested, assimilated, and then eventually penetrated by the development of wisdom, by the development of insight. And those chapters take topics that are primarily dealt with in the Nikāyas, in the Sutta Pitaka. But it treats those particular topics, which are the 5 aggregates, the 12 sense bases, the 18 elements, 4 noble truths, dependent origination. It treats those topics not according to the simpler method of the suttas, but it treats them according to the more detailed, more analytical, detailed. It treats them according to the more detailed and analytical method of the Abhidhamma. And so those of you who have attended the early Abhidhamma retreats and have worked through the Manual of Abhidhamma, when you look at these chapters, especially the one on the aggregates that we're going to do this weekend, you'll see that there's a lot of correspondence between the treatment of the five aggregates in the Visuddhimagga and the analysis of consciousness and mental factors and matter in the Manual of Abhidhamma. And when you see this correspondence, you might think, in fact, it's an easy assumption to make, the Visuddhimagga is basing this on the Manual of Abhidhamma. But actually, the Abhidhammata Sangaha, the Manual of Abhidhamma, was composed some 500 or 600 years after the Visuddhimagga. The Visuddhimagga was composed in the 5th century in Sri Lanka on the basis of older commentaries which had been passed down, I guess, for centuries in the Mahavihara, the great monastery in Anuradhapura, whereas the Abhidhammata Sangaha was composed, I think the exact time that it was composed is not known, but conjectured around the 11th century in Sri Lanka. And so the Manual of Abhidhamma is actually 600 years or so later than the Visuddhimagga. Okay, now the chapters in the Visuddhimagga that deal with the topics that we're going to be discussing this weekend begin with chapter 14. And so I'm going to now call up chapter 14 and then take a look at some passages from this chapter. But before I go into the detailed explanation of the Abhidhamma sections of the Visuddhimagga, what we're going to be dealing with through most of this evening are passages from the Sutta Pitaka, particularly from the Khanda Samyutta, the collected discourses on the aggregates that discuss or explain the five aggregates. So this evening we take a look, a kind of overview of the Nikāya perspective on the five aggregates. And then starting tomorrow, we move in the more technical Abhidhamma perspective on the aggregates. The cover picture is from the Kaileniya Mahavihara in Sri Lanka, and this is supposed to be a picture of Buddhaghosa. I guess this is Buddhaghosa presenting the text of the Visuddhimagga to the Sangha, the assembled Sangha at the Mahavihara. And you can see the monks have their spittoons. Okay, so you can see here that the text has, perhaps I have to increase the magnification. Can people in the back see? Or shall I go, let's see if we could go some degrees higher. How is this? In the back? If you can see? Okay. I heard, by the way, when I was coming up here, I heard Venerable Jishu say that this is going to be a relaxed retreat. And I'm thinking, no, it's not going to be very relaxed. Maybe the schedule is relaxed, but by the time you get out of here on Monday, your head might have been exploded. Okay, so you could see here that this portion begins with a heading, understanding. And here the Pali word is actually panya, which is usually translated as wisdom. And even though even wisdom is not fully satisfactory as a rendering for panya, I actually much prefer it to understanding, since understanding can apply to understanding physics, understanding somebody's way of speech. But panya, as we're going to see, is a very special kind, an elevated or higher kind of understanding, of more, let's say, an experiential understanding and realization. And so within the proper scheme of development, wisdom or understanding is to be developed on the basis when one first has cultivated sila, which is translated here as virtue, and has become possessed of the more advanced development of concentration. This is by the attainment of samadhi, preferably up to the level of the jhanas, according to the Visuddhimagga scheme. But we are going to be going into the territory of wisdom or understanding, with probably in most cases without that foundation, hopefully with the foundation of sila, good behavior, and with some development of meditation, but not necessarily to those advanced stages of samadhi. Okay, so here the text raises the question, what is understanding? What is wisdom? And it says that wisdom is of many sorts and has various aspects. But we're going to confine ourselves here to understanding or wisdom consisting in insight knowledge, that is vipassana jnana. So we're concerned now, sort of the kind of wisdom that this section of the Visuddhimagga is concerned with is the development of insight wisdom. But in order to develop insight wisdom, one has to become familiar with, to become acquainted with, to become thoroughly conversant with those particular domains of knowledge that constitute the soil of wisdom. Okay, so the text explains that panya is to be understood in the sense of the act of understanding. So all this explanation does is to convert this one noun, panya, into an action noun, pajanana. Pajanana is the act of understanding. I should explain the word panya itself. I have to open up a blank document. Yeah, the word panya comes from the prefix pa plus a root nya, which means to know. And from this root nya, we get various verbs signifying knowledge. Like janati is the verb that means to know. Okay, then the prefix pa gives the root nya, when it's joined to the root nya, it takes on a special meaning. So it means not simply conceptual knowledge, but it comes on to take on the meaning of penetrative knowledge or direct experiential knowledge, which is why we translate this as wisdom. Okay, then the Visuddhimagga gives us an explanation of the characteristic, function, manifestation, and proximate cause of this wisdom. We're going to meet this fourfold scheme again and again in the course of this retreat. This is a scheme that the commentaries have developed in order to explain any phenomenon. So any phenomena, to understand it thoroughly or adequately, one has to know what is the distinctive characteristic of that phenomenon. What is its distinctive mark? Sort of its defining mark, defining characteristic. Then one has to understand how it operates, what its function is, what its task or purpose is. Then one has to understand how it appears in experience, what is its manifestation. And then one has to understand what is its proximate cause, how does it arise, what is the underlying condition for that particular phenomenon. Okay, so here, the text explains that panya, or wisdom, has the... First I'll read the translation here, which I'm not so happy with, then I'll give my own explanation. Okay, so it says that understanding has the characteristic of penetrating the individual essences of states. And then this is the Pali. I don't know if you could see it. Can you see it from the back? Okay. So the Pali is Dhamma Sabhava Pativeda Lakkhana. Lakkhana is characteristic. And so penetration is Pativeda. That's a good translation. Then what's called states is Dhamma, which I would render phenomena. This would comprise all mental and physical phenomena. And then the word, or the translation that I'm not so happy with, is individual essences, which is a translation of the Pali word sabhava. The word sabhava, I would prefer to render the real nature. So we would say, or I would retranslate this, wisdom has the characteristic of penetrating the real nature of phenomena. And then its function, it said, is to abolish the darkness of delusion which conceals the real, here I'll use my own preferred rendering, which conceals the real nature of phenomena. So normally we think we see and understand things as they actually are, but according to the Buddha's teaching, there is this quality of, here it's called delusion, elsewhere it's called avidya, ignorance, which shrouds or covers over the mind. It sort of pervades the mind, and by pervading the mind, somewhat like the cataracts prevent us from seeing the visible objects in front of us. And so delusion or ignorance prevents us from accurately seeing and correctly understanding the real nature of dhammas, the real nature of phenomena. And so instead of seeing things as they actually are, we see them in a distorted way. Often the distortions are explained as fourfold, seeing that which is impermanent as being permanent, seeing that which is really dukkha, unsatisfactory, as being enjoyable, seeing that which is non-self as being a self, and seeing that which is impure or not beautiful as being beautiful. Okay, so that is the function of wisdom, is to abolish this darkness of delusion. And then when wisdom appears, when it becomes manifest as the elimination of delusion. And so it's said that it appears as non-delusion. And then, based on a sutta statement that one who is concentrated knows and sees correctly, it's said that the proximate cause of wisdom is samadhi, or concentration. And so to reach the actual experiential or penetrative wisdom, one has to develop some facility or skill in samadhi or concentration, and then one uses the concentrated mind to investigate and examine the bodily and mental phenomena. And when that investigation brings those phenomena into focus, then their real nature, their true characteristics appear. Okay, so now there's sometimes this Visuddhimagga has a tendency towards too much elaboration, too much, we would use the word papancha. So one has to sort of know how to jump around within this work to avoid all of that unnecessary elaboration and to get to the critical portions. Okay, so now the text raises the question, how is this wisdom to be developed? And even though wisdom is to be developed through the systematic cultivation of insight meditation, but first, as I said earlier, one has to become acquainted with the raw material upon which wisdom is going to operate, upon which insight is going to develop. Okay, so now the text says that the things classed as the aggregates, the sense bases, that's the 12 sense bases, the elements, those are the 18 elements, the sense faculties, the Four Noble Truths, dependent origination, are the soil of this understanding, of this wisdom. So the first two purifications, that's the purification of virtue and the purification of mind or concentration, are the roots of wisdom. And the later purifications, which are the stages of insight knowledge, those are said to be the trunk of the path. So the roots, good conduct and concentration. The trunk is the development of insight knowledge, but the soil from which that insight knowledge emerges and grows is the investigation of these particular topics, the five aggregates, and so forth. And so, the text says, that one who is trying to perfect these stages of insight knowledge should first fortify or strengthen his knowledge by learning and questioning. That is, here we have, over this course, we'll have some discourses, and then you listen, that's learning. Then each day we have question and answer periods, that's questioning. So that listening and questioning about these particular topics, that will be the soil from which wisdom will arise. Oops. Okay, so now the text is going to begin by going into the first of these various topics for the development of wisdom. The first topic that comes within this sphere of the soil of wisdom. And the first of those topics are the five aggregates. So here it just enumerates them: material form, feeling, perception, formations, mental formations, and consciousness. And then it will go into the detailed, technical, elaborate Abhidhamma treatment of the five aggregates, which we are going to start tomorrow. So this evening, what I wish to do is to go in to give a broad overview of the sutta treatment of the five aggregates. Okay, can you see it all right in the back? Okay. Okay, now the five aggregates are already mentioned in the Buddha's first discourse. If you pay close attention to the Buddha's elaboration of the first noble truth, usually people pay attention to birth as suffering, illness is suffering, old age is suffering, death is suffering, to be united with what is unpleasant is suffering, to be separated from what is beloved is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. And then they just sort of skip over the very last item there. But if you pay attention, you see the very last item the Buddha mentions under the noble truth of dukkha. He says, in short, or in brief, the five aggregates, which are the subject to clinging, are dukkha. So already we find the five aggregates mentioned not simply as one item amongst others, not simply lying alongside birth, old age, sickness, and death, but it's said in brief, in short, as though the five aggregates are actually summing up, comprising all the other forms of dukkha. And so we find another sutta, a short sutta, not as well known as the first one. This is Samyutta Nikāya, same chapter, chapter 56, but this is sutta number 13, where the text opens by saying that there are these four noble truths. Then it comes, what is the noble truth of dukkha, of suffering? And it doesn't even say birth, old age, sickness, death, as if for the audience that the Buddha is addressing here, those kinds of elementary types of dukkha, not necessary to hear. But in this sutta, the Buddha goes directly into the essential matter, that these five aggregates, it should be said, the five aggregates subject to clinging, this is called the noble truth of dukkha. And then the rest just follows the same pattern of the Four Noble Truths. In another sutta, the Buddha speaks of the five aggregates as the burden. So this is the burden that we are carrying around from one life to the next, is this collection of the five aggregates. And then what causes us from life to life to pick up the five aggregates, to take up the five aggregates, is craving. And so when craving is said to be the origin of dukkha or suffering, it doesn't simply mean that on the psychological level, when we have craving, then we're subject to meet disappointment, grief, anxiety, sorrow, misery, and so on. But when there's craving coupled with ignorance, then when we put down one set of five aggregates at death, through that craving, we pick up another set of five aggregates with the next birth, or actually conception. And in that way, the picking up of the burden of the five aggregates goes on from one existence to the next. In going back to the Buddha's first discourse, the turning of the wheel of Dharma, in that discourse, after explaining the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha assigns a task or a project to each of the Noble Truths. And the task that he assigns to the Noble Truth of suffering is full understanding. The truth of suffering is pariññayang. It is to be fully understood. In this sutta that I have here, the Buddha says, I will teach you things that should be fully understood and the full understanding of them. So the things that should be fully understood are nothing other than the five aggregates. So this means that to fully understand the noble truth of suffering, what one actually has to understand are the five aggregates. So that is why this task that we're going to be, or the subject that we're going to be exploring over this weekend is extremely important in fulfilling the work of cultivating the Four Noble Truths. And then the full understanding of these things, or actually, probably more accurately, what happens when these five aggregates are fully understood, is that there is the destruction of lust, the destruction of hatred, the destruction of delusion. So these are the three unwholesome roots, the three deep roots of suffering. And so when the five aggregates are fully understood, lust, hatred, and delusion are destroyed, eliminated. Okay, these suttas I could just touch on very briefly. Here, again, to emphasize the importance of understanding the five aggregates, the Buddha says, without directly knowing and fully understanding form, feeling, and so forth, without becoming dispassionate towards them, one is incapable of destroying suffering. But by directly knowing and fully understanding the five aggregates, one is capable of destroying suffering. Okay, this is a sutta which gives a somewhat more detailed examination of the five aggregates. Okay, so in this sutta, a monk comes to the Buddha and raises the question, in what way does this term aggregates apply to the aggregates? And I should put the Pali word here, though probably most of you are familiar with it. The word translated as aggregate the Pali word is khandha. And for those who familiar with traditions deriving from Sanskrit, the Sanskrit word is skandha. It's always been a curious question for me. You know, we use this word aggregate, and it's kind of like become part of standard Bunglish, Budenglish, so that when we Buddhists or people who are involved with Buddhist studies get together, we speak very casually about the five aggregates, and we all know what it means. But if I were to stand up in front of, maybe I'm called to give a talk to a college class on some aspects of Buddhist philosophy, and I were to say, well, the Buddha says that we have to fully understand the five aggregates, everybody would be looking at me with puzzlement. Because how do we use the word aggregate? I mean, we hardly ever use it in ordinary English. Like in economics, they speak about aggregate demand, the sum of things as an aggregate. But probably in the late 19th century, some British translator of Buddhist texts came across this word khandha and thought, how do we render this? And he chose the word aggregate. And then the next generation, or maybe the contemporary translators thought, so-and-so has come up with this word aggregate, we'll use it too. And then before long, everybody is using the word aggregate. And so it's become standard Buddha English. Does anybody know German or read Buddhist texts in Buddhist texts in German? I believe the German translators came across or use a German word. I don't really know German, but I think I've come across through a long association with an elder German monk some German Buddhist terminology. They use the word Gruppen, which corresponds to our English word group. And so it could have been a much easier task for us if the early English translators, British translators, had come up with the word group instead of aggregate. I think the Chinese translators use yun, which I think in its ordinary sense means to collect or to gather. Is that correct? Yeah, so collection would be quite also a good rendering. Anyway, to continue with our text. So he's asking, in what sense does the word khanda apply to these things that are called khandas? And here the Buddha says, whatever kind of material form there is, past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, this is called the form aggregate. And then the same applies to feeling, perception, here I use volitional formations, consciousness. So in other words, khanda is a kind of category for comprising, incorporating, bringing together each instance of that particular factor that gives its name to that particular aggregate. So any kind of material form, here it's distinguished according to time, position, and so forth. We're going to get into these specifications later. But the important point here is that any instance of material form belongs to the form aggregate. Any kind of feeling belongs to the feeling aggregate. And so with perception, any kind of volitional activities belongs to the volitional formations aggregate. And all consciousness, any kind, any occasion of consciousness, belongs to the consciousness aggregate. Okay, then in the next question, this monk asks for the cause and condition, the reason for the manifestation of each of these aggregates. Here the Buddha explains that the four great elements, which we will be coming to in detail tomorrow, but these are the four primary elements of earth, water, fire, and air. That is the cause and condition for the manifestation of the material form aggregate. The four great elements actually belong to material form. They're the primary instances of material form, but they are also the condition for all other instances or manifestations of material form. Then we have contact as the cause and condition for the manifestation of the middle three aggregates, feeling, perception, and volitional formations. What is contact? Contact is the coming together of consciousness with its object through a particular sense faculty or sense base. And so when the when I consciousness, let's say when consciousness comes together with a visible form through the I faculty, that meeting of the consciousness with the form through the I is contact. And conditioned by that contact, there arises a feeling, one feels the object in a particular way, a perception, one perceives particular aspects of the object, and a response will take place in regard to that object, some kind of volitional response, some kind of intentional response. So that is the volitional formation. And then the cause and condition for the manifestation of the consciousness aggregate is what is called nama-rupa. This is name, we translate name and form. So nama-rupa actually comprises material form, and under name, or nama, it includes feeling, perception, and volition, volitional activity. So the other, you could say the other aggregates are the cause and condition for the consciousness aggregate. In fact, consciousness in turn is the cause and condition for name and form. So those two are sort of locked together in a relationship of mutual conditioning. Okay, the reason why the Buddha devotes so much attention to the five aggregates is because these aggregates are the primary basis for the arising of the sense of self. So the sense of self arises through the activity of the five aggregates. And then when that sense of self has arisen, when one accepts that idea of self, then one seeks to give some, call it substance or meaning to the idea of self. And when one tries to find a substance or a basis for the idea of self, one does so by looking at one or another of the five aggregates and thinking, this is what I am, this is myself. Or I have a self which stands in some relation to these five aggregates. And so in order to, this sense of self is a kind of outgrowth of craving. It's the craving for security, for identity, that gives rise to the sense of self. And then the sense of self tries to find confirmation of that sense of identity by looking at the five aggregates and thinking, what am I? And then one comes to the conclusion, I am form, I am feeling, perception, volitions, consciousness. Okay, then, now this inquiry goes further into what is called the gratification or the enjoyment in regard to each of the five aggregates, the danger and the escape. And we could see here a certain pattern. Actually, it's somewhat related to the pattern of the Four Noble Truths, where gratification, this is the enjoyment that one finds in the five aggregates, which is the pleasure and joy that arise in dependence on them. But then the danger corresponds to the first noble truth. That is the suffering, or more fully, the fact that each of these five aggregates is impermanent suffering and subject to change. So when one sees the danger in them, then one seeks the escape from the five aggregates. And the escape from the five aggregates lies in the removal and abandoning of desire and lust for them. Okay, and then here, the monk, now he goes to maybe this is the deepest question, the most pithy question. He says, how should one know and see so that in regard to this consciousness and to this body, together with consciousness, and in regard to all external objects, there is no longer any I-making, mind-making, and tendency to conceit. And then the Buddha says that any kind of form, whatever, past, present, or future, one sees all form as it really is with wisdom. This is not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. The same with feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. So one sees the five aggregates as being not mine, not I, not myself. And even though this might be to actually eradicate I-making, mind-making, and the tendency to conceit, this might occur with like the highest development of wisdom, but one could start even at a very simple reflective level using this template, not mine, not I, not myself, to examine the five aggregates conceptually, and it will help to gradually weaken or reduce the identification with the five aggregates. I mean, even like if you have some illness and distress and worry is building up based on the illness, you could apply this contemplation to the form aggregate and the feeling aggregate. This is not mine. I'm not this, not myself. It doesn't mean the illness will go away, but the worry and concern that constellate, that gather up based upon the illness, that will tend to be dispelled. Okay, in this sutta, the Buddha gives a more elaborate investigation of the five aggregates. So he begins by elaborating, or first enumerating the five aggregates. Then he makes a very, very potent statement. He says, so long as I did not directly know as they really are, the five aggregates in four phases, I did not claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world with its devas, maras, and so on. Okay, so the Buddha is actually declaring here that in a way, the full understanding of these five aggregates was actually the content of his full enlightenment experience. At least from one angle, one could look at it in that way. And so he's here going to explain the five aggregates by way of what he calls four phases, and that is knowing each aggregate, knowing its origin, its cessation, and the way leading to its cessation. And so here he begins with material form. So what is form? It's the four great elements and the material form derived from the four elements. And then as the cause or condition for the arising of form, we have nutriment. Apparently this is referring in this sutta to form as the physical body. So it's nutriment that sustains and upholds the physical body. And then with the cessation of nutriment, there's the cessation of form. And the Noble Eightfold Path is the way to the cessation of form. Okay, here we have feeling. So what is feeling? We have the 6 classes of feeling. So this is feeling born from contact at each of the 6 sense faculties. And then again, as in the previous sutta, we have contact as the cause or origin of feeling. And then we have perception is here divided into 6 types according to, this is interesting, perception is distinguished into 6 types according to the object of perception. So we have perception of forms, visible forms, perception of sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects or textures, and then perception of mental phenomena. And the condition for the arising of perception, again, it's contact. Then we have the volitional activities, or volitional formations, and this is explained as 6 types of volition. So that is volition regarding, again, according to the objects, volition in regard to visible forms, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, and volition in regard to mental phenomena. And the condition for the arising of volition is also contact. But then when we come to consciousness, we find that consciousness is distinguished not according to the object here, but according to the sense base through which it arises. So we have 6 types of consciousness. And so what are those 6 types? Eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose, tongue, body, and mind consciousness. And then, as in the other sutta, the condition for consciousness is name and form, nama-rupa. Okay, here, is this getting boring? Or too detailed or technical? I'm always afraid that I'm putting people to... Okay, so... Okay, so this is a sutta which deals with the designations for the 5 aggregates. So why is each aggregate designated in such a way? So here it says, why do you call it form? And here there is a word play in Pali that's very difficult to replicate in English. Yeah, I lost my accents. Okay, the Pali word that's rendered material form is rupa. And the text is explaining that this is derived This is derived from a word rupati, which means to be worn away. Okay, now the Pali word rupa really has nothing to do with the word rupati. They have two completely different origins. But the text is just making a play, a kind of word play here, of saying that material form is so called because it undergoes rupati, it undergoes wear and tear. So the body is worn and torn. So I tried to capture this in translation by saying it is deformed, therefore it is called form. So it is deformed by cold, by heat, by hunger, by thirst, by flies, mosquitoes, wind, and so forth. So that is why it is called form, because it's deformed. Okay, then why do you call it feeling? It feels, therefore it is called feeling. And what does it feel? Here the text explains feeling by way of the three primary feeling tones, not by way of the contact as in the other sutta, but as pleasure, pain, and neither pain nor pleasure. Okay, now the text is asking, why do you call it perception? And then it said the answer is that it perceives, therefore it is called perception. So what does it perceive? And then it explains in terms of different colors. It perceives blue, yellow, red, white, and so on. Okay, then we have the explanation for the word sankhara, which is rendered here it's rendered volitional formations. But to capture the wordplay here, it could have been perhaps better rendered constructions. So why do you call them constructions? Then the answer would be, they construct the constructed, therefore they are called constructions. So what is the constructed that they construct? They construct, should be constructed form as form. They construct constructed feeling as feeling, perception as perception, constructions as constructions. They construct consciousness as consciousness. So the point here is that it is our volitional activities that create the karma that constructs or puts together this particular assemblage of the five aggregates. So in that way, our acts of volition, our volitional activities, are also constructive activities that are continually sort of creating that kind of energy, that kind of potency that at death is going to bring into being a new assemblage of the five aggregates and then continue to condition them through the course of the lifespan. Okay, then finally we come to consciousness, and this is very puzzling to me. So it said, why do you call it consciousness? It cognizes. So that is quite understandable. The Pali verb is vijanati, which is the verb that will yield the noun vijnana, consciousness. The puzzle here is, what does it cognize? It cognizes sour, bitter, pungent, sweet, sharp, mild, salty, bland. So it's explaining consciousness in a very similar way to the way perception is explained, except perception is explained in terms of colors. And consciousness is explained in terms of tastes. But basically the principle seems the same. So it seems to me that it should be perception that also perceives taste. Okay, I want to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to jump through some of the other texts that I assembled and come to this sutta, which provides a simile for each of the five aggregates in order to underscore the empty or void nature of each of the five aggregates. And so this is a very famous sutta, and perhaps this was a sutta which influenced the Indian Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna in formulating his teaching of shunyata or emptiness. Even though the sutta does not use the word sunya itself, but it uses other words which suggest that same idea. Okay, so in the first case, the Buddha and the monks are sitting by the bank of the river Ganges. And so the Buddha says, suppose that on the river Ganges, a great lump of foam was floating by, and then a man with good eyesight would examine it, and it would appear to him to be void, hollow, and insubstantial. For what substance or essence could there be in a lump of foam? And so, whatever kind of material form there is, past, future, or present, and so on, one examines it, investigates it, and it appears to the eye of insight to be void, hollow, and insubstantial. It's quite remarkable that the Buddha would have compared material form to a lump of foam back in India 2,500 years ago. Now we understand the nature of matter. You know, they say that the nucleus of an atom would be, if you have like a whole football field, the nucleus of the atom would be like a football placed in the middle of the football field, and the electrons would be like a few fans sitting in the bleachers, and all of the rest is just empty space. So that is form, like a lump of foam. Then for feeling, suppose in the autumn when it is raining and big drops are falling, then water bubbles arise and burst on the surface of the water. And sometimes if there are heavy drops of water, those bubbles can be quite big and they look like a dome, like a glass dome. But the man with good sight would investigate those water bubbles, and they appear to him to be void, hollow, and insubstantial. And so one investigates feeling, again with the eye of insight, and feeling turns out to be void, hollow, and insubstantial, for there's no substance in feeling. Okay, then during the summertime, the hot season, you'll see this yourself, what if you're driving during the summer on a flat road, and it appears that there's a pool of water ahead of you, but when you reach that spot where there appeared to be the pool of water, there's nothing there, just the road. It's dry. And so this is a shimmering mirage appears, and the man with good sight inspects it, and that mirage, that water on the horizon, turns out to be void, hollow, insubstantial. And then to illustrate the aggregate of volitional formations, the Buddha uses the simile of the trunk of a plantain or banana tree. If you've ever seen a banana tree cut down, and you might think that there's some heartwood at the center of it, but you unroll the coils and there's just one coil wrapping another, wrapping another, wrapping another. And when you get to the last coil, there's just no heartwood at all. And so the volitional activities are like the trunk of a plantain or a banana tree. And then to illustrate consciousness, the Buddha compares it to a magician or a magician's apprentice who would display a magical illusion. He takes some twigs and leaves and sticks and pebbles, puts them together, recites some mantras over them, and waves a curtain over them, and then removes the curtain, and there's a bunny rabbit arisen from the sticks and pebbles. Okay, but if you examine, well, it doesn't work with the bunny rabbit, but you examine the illusion carefully, and you see that there's really nothing there. And so that is like the aggregate of consciousness. It's like a magical illusion. And so the verse says, form is like a lump of foam, feeling like a water bubble, perception is like a mirage, volition's like a plantain trunk, and consciousness like an illusion. So explained the Buddha, kinsman of the sun. Okay, maybe this will do for the introductory discourse on the aggregates from a sutta perspective. If you have any questions, maybe we could take about 10 minutes of questions. Please feel welcome to ask. Oh, you have to remember, even for those who came last time, for new people, I have 4 rules governing the asking of questions. First, one should stand up. Second rule is to speak loudly and clearly into the microphone. Third rule, the question has to be pertinent to the subject matter. And the fourth rule is the question has to be clear and concise. As I've said in the past, if anybody wants to give a lecture, I'm happy to step down and to sit in the student seats. Okay, please. Excuse me?
I forgot 1 and 2. I hope I do this right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Monty. Do I say my name? No, I don't have to do that, do
Yeah,
I?
it's good to say your name so everybody gets to hear it also, yeah.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Regina. Well, I just had a question. I first had a question on contact, the various types of contact and what that word means. I mean, the way I see it is if you open your eyes and you see something, that's contact, am I right? Like when it said, is my question succinct enough?
No, it's succinct. Yeah.
Eye contact.
Okay. What I would say is that the act of seeing is actually a complex phenomenon. And so within the act of seeing, there are what the Buddhist texts do, and then the Abhidhamma does this even in more detail, is to sort of analyze or dissect that act of seeing, or could be hearing, smelling, into the different constituents that are involved. So contact, as we're going to see later, but I'll just to anticipate what will be said later, it is a kind of mental touching, the mind mentally touching the object or encountering the object. So it's an encounter that takes place between consciousness and the object. And it's that encounter with the object that generates the perception, which is the mental grasping or focusing on the particular characteristics of the object. And then it's the consciousness in the background, which is the awareness that makes that act of seeing possible.
So I just wanted to follow up. So I think you used this example before, like if you see something and you apply something to it, like you see somebody and you say, oh, that person's really beautiful, that's illustrative of contact. And then how I feel about that in relation to that.
There are many different stages in the act of, say, perceiving a person. So each stage, contact is present.
Okay.
So even before you identify the object, there's just the reception of the form, say, the bare form, but there's contact in that bare reception of the form. Even before the idea comes, I know that person, or I don't know that person, or that person is beautiful, whatever. That comes, like that from an Abhidhamma perspective, rather late in the sequence of acts of consciousness.
Okay.
I think that this will become clearer as we go along.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, Milind.
Hi, Bhante.
Yeah.
My name is Milind.
Yeah.
I have difficulty visualizing what is wisdom. I understand that with the wisdom we can go to the path of enlightenment, but if I want to put it in a layman terms, let's say, can wisdom make me rich?
Can wisdom make you rich?
Yeah, I mean, what is wisdom in that sense?
Yeah, as the Visuddhimagga explains, there are many kinds of panya, many kinds of wisdom, but the particular wisdom that we are concerned with here is the wisdom of insight. And this is, we say that mental act, mental process by which one comes to see and understand the actual characteristics of material or bodily and mental phenomena. The mental process by which one comes to see what are the distinctive characteristics of material form, feeling, perception, volitional activities, and consciousness, and then comes to see what are the common or general characteristics of all of these phenomena.
So wisdom is an essential prerequisite for enlightenment.
Yeah, wisdom is that the main, the faculty that plays the primary role in the process of cultivation towards the attainment of enlightenment.
Thank you.
Okay, we can take one more question, then we want to conclude with a short meditation.
Hi, I'm Lucille.
Lucille.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't understand the difference. Why is form an individual aggregate if the other four are part of form?
If the other four are what?
It says the four great elements, contact, feeling, perception, and volitional formations, are the cause and condition of form.
Oh,
So
no.
why is form...
Oh, no. You're taking the four great elements to be feeling, perception. Is that what you were saying?
Yes. No, but besides the name of the four great elements, why are they... doesn't form comprise the other four?
The other four aggregates?
Yes.
No.
What is form?
No, the four great elements are the earth element, the water element, the heat or fire element, and the air element.
Mm-hmm.
So those are material.
Got it.
Yeah, those are distinct from the other four aggregates, which are mental aggregates.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we will stop the discussion now for the evening, and we'll move over to the other section, and we'll conclude with a short meditation.